Back for this last section, where we'll be talking about eradication of smallpox. And it's believed smallpox emerged in Africa up to 10,000 years ago. And we do have some very ancient evidence of smallpox infection, similar to what we talked about with poliovirus, um, that popped up in some of the ancient Egyptian artwork. We can actually see evidence in several mummies, including this one of an Egyptian pharaoh, Ramses V, who died in 1156 BC. He's got that very characteristic scarring on his face that was most likely due to smallpox. Of course, we don't know for sure. And Ramses was not alone in terms of famous figures that have had smallpox. You've got quite a long list here of emperors and kings and queens that died of smallpox. Number of the most famous U.S. presidents: George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Andrew Jackson, all had smallpox and thankfully survived. So just illustrating the fact that smallpox was very widespread and was a persistent problem and a serious killer. So of course, because of the high mortality rate, 30%, there was a huge interest in trying any means of protection possible. And we'd already touched on variolation, which was kind of the initial primitive version of smallpox vaccination that's been used for hundreds of years, where they were basically just taking dried scabs or fluid from the pox of individuals, grinding that up and using a needle to inoculate that material directly. And that would, of course, actually give you smallpox, but it would give you a milder form with a much lower, at least a 10 times lower fatality rate. So, it was a bit of a bit of a risk still, but you might prefer to take your chances with a 2% chance of dying over a 30%. And another issue with variolation was this technique itself was spreading other diseases, things like syphilis and hepatitis. So definitely not without issue. And then, of course, there was famously Edward Jenner, the English physician who in the late 1700s started collecting fluid from cowpox sores that would commonly occur on the hands of milkmaids, and realized that this could be used to protect people from smallpox. So use some of the fluid from those sores basically as a first round of vaccination. And so that was quite successful, as we talked about, and he really popularized that technique, even though he didn't come up with that himself. But he's the one that's always associated with it. And so then, now we actually have a more modern version of the smallpox virus. And it was determined through some analysis at the turn of the century, in the early 1900s, that this was no longer identical to cowpox virus. So they actually gave it a new name, called it vaccinia virus, since it was being used in vaccination. And it's probably a descendant of the cowpox virus that came just through passaging that through animals. They would passage it through animals to obtain more material for vaccination, but it's also possible that it could actually be a mutated form of the variola virus itself that causes smallpox, or potentially even a horsepox virus. So the origins are a little bit unclear. It's probably a descendant of the cowpox virus. But as I discussed earlier in this chapter, this vaccinia is the strain that's used in the vaccine and that is now used in most research. All right, so in terms of eradication efforts, In the late 1960s, the World Health Organization got a couple $1 million from both the Soviet Union and the United States government to push through this eradication program. And so at that time in the late 60s, we had about 10 to 15 million cases of smallpox globally every year, a couple million deaths, so it was still a substantial problem. And there was a number of reasons that smallpox was a good candidate for potential eradication, just like we discussed with poliovirus. Variola can only infect humans, so you don't have to worry about an animal reservoir. And unlike poliovirus, you do not have subclinical infection. So if you have smallpox, you know it, right? That person obviously has symptoms. As we'll talk about here in a minute, that made it possible to do kind of more targeted vaccinations instead of having to vaccinate every person. The virus is spread through droplets, so you're not going to get long-distance transmission. Basically, you had to come into close contact with somebody with smallpox. And in terms of the vaccination itself, there were freeze-dried versions that didn't require refrigeration, so it would be easy to get those out into parts of the world where it was hot and there potentially was no refrigeration available. So just a logistical issue. And this is kind of terrifying if you don't like injections, but the standard needle used for and technique used for smallpox vaccination is what's called this bifurcated needle, where it basically has two tips, and you would get a drop of the vaccination material between the 2 points, and then that gets essentially just jabbed into the shoulder. And usually if it was just the initial vaccination, you would get 3 pokes in basically the same spot with that needle. If it was a booster, you would get 15 pokes in the same spot. And so this would result in a substantial scar. If you know anybody who had the smallpox vaccination, you've got a nice almost dimple on your shoulder where this process called scarification takes place. So not the most pleasant of vaccinations. So yeah, 1 dose they call it, but that's really up to 15 punctures. So I'm glad we don't have to have that anymore. Initially, this eradication effort called for trying to vaccinate every individual, but as we said, because they realized, okay, there are no subclinical infections, so we can actually see who has smallpox and who doesn't. We can do surveillance, containment, and carry out what's called just ring vaccination, so vaccinating people that would potentially come into close contact with someone with smallpox, so a much more targeted effort. But still, this is a huge amount of work, right? You're talking about visiting, millions of homes and vaccinating large numbers of people. And to really completely eradicate smallpox, this would mean, there would have to be very good record keeping to keep track of every smallpox incident everywhere in the world. So they actually, started providing monetary rewards for reporting cases. Here you're seeing, villagers trying to help a aid work van get through a muddy rural road to provide vaccinations. And this effort worked famously. So in the mid-1970s, we were down to smallpox cases in only a small part of Africa. And in November 1977, we had the last natural case, which occurred in Somalia. This guy here on the right was supposedly the last case of smallpox. He looks pretty happy about that. So, once we were fairly confident that eradication had occurred, in 1980, it was basically recommended that all countries stop routine vaccination. So the U.S. had actually stopped a while before that, 1972, because it had been eradicated in the U.S. for a number of years already. Um, but there were some potential complications from the smallpox vaccine itself because it was a live attenuated virus, that vaccinia virus, as we discussed. So there was just no reason to risk any of those complications by continuing vaccination. All right, so just a couple of considerations regarding the fact that we have stopped vaccinating is now we do have a very large population of people in the world that have not been vaccinated. Um, so if it were to reappear or to be used as a biological weapon, that could be a significant problem. You have got a large susceptible population, um, and you know there are some of those other pox viruses that are similar. For example, monkeypox, um, which can infect humans and does have a not totally insignificant mortality rate in humans. There is some protection against that afforded by the smallpox virus, quite good protection, 85%. So that you could make the argument that, well, we should continue the smallpox vaccination just to try to help prevent from potential monkeypox outbreaks. The symptoms of monkeypox are basically identical to smallpox, but you get the added benefit of having very swollen lymph nodes on top of that. And there have been some monkeypox outbreaks in the worldwide, even in the U.S. So 2003, we had 47 confirmed cases, and this was kind of strangely tied to these pet prairie dogs that had been infected, coming from they had been in close proximity to some rodents that had been imported from Africa. So nobody died in that case, but there certainly was that potential. Um, and then lastly, monkeypox is not surprisingly still an ongoing issue in Africa. So, this little news article from a couple of years ago, they're talking about, Nigeria having a monkeypox outbreak. So well, I guess what I'm getting at here is, you can still make the argument that, well, maybe we should start vaccinating again just to try to prevent some bigger outbreak of some of these other pox viruses that could